The house seemed to breathe. Emily stood at the bottom of the hill, staring up at the Whitaker house. It loomed over the landscape, an imposing silhouette framed by a sunless sky. The wind teased her hair, carrying with it a faint scent of damp wood and something metallic, coppery and sharp, like blood. "Jack, are you seeing this?" Emily turned to her husband, shielding her eyes from the glaring sun peeking through the clouds. Jack stood beside her, his hands on his hips, grinning like a child on Christmas morning. "It's perfect. Look at the character. Those old turrets. The wraparound porch. Come on, Em, this place was made for us." Emily wasn't so sure. The house looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The paint peeled in long strips, revealing weathered wood beneath. A few windows were cracked, one on the second floor was broken entirely, its jagged edges glinting like broken teeth. But Jack was already heading up the overgrown path toward the front door, his boundless enthusiasm dragging her behind him. The house had been a steal. An online listing with a price so low it almost felt like a scam. Jack had been skeptical at first, but a quick phone call revealed the truth. The Whitaker house had been on the market for decades, the subject of too many rumors. People claimed it was haunted. Others said it was cursed. Emily had laughed when Jack told her, but now, standing in its shadow, the weight of those stories pressed against her chest. Inside, the air was heavy and stale. Dust motes hung in the beams of light streaming through the broken windows. The grand entryway stretched up 2 stories, the banister of the staircase curving like the spine of some slumbering beast. "Imagine this after we clean it up," Jack said, his voice echoing. Emily tried to imagine it, but her eyes kept darting to the corners where the shadows clung, dark and unmoving, as though they were watching. The first week passed in a blur of cleaning and unpacking. Emily and Jack spent their days hauling boxes, sweeping floors, and patching holes in the walls. They fell into bed each night exhausted but satisfied. But as the days stretched on, Emily began to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the odd noises, creaks and groans that seemed louder than they should have been. It wasn't the way the air seemed to grow colder in certain rooms, or how she sometimes caught the faintest whiff of that metallic scent. It was the way the house felt. Emily couldn't explain it, but sometimes, when she walked into a room, it was as if the walls leaned closer. As if the house was listening. Jack brushed off her concerns. "It's an old house, Em. Of course, it's going to feel weird at first." But by the end of the week, even Jack couldn't deny that something was off. It started with the doors. Emily was in the kitchen unpacking boxes when she heard a loud slam. She jumped, nearly dropping a stack of plates, and ran to the source of the noise. The front door was wide open, banging against the wall with each gust of wind. She frowned. Jack had left hours ago to pick up supplies. She was sure she'd locked the door behind him. She closed it, twisting the old brass lock until it clicked. Later that night, when Jack returned, he found her in the living room staring at the same door, her arms wrapped around herself. "It keeps opening," she whispered. "I've locked it 3 times, Jack. I even shoved a chair under the handle, but..." He looked at the door. It was wide open, the chair she'd wedged beneath it lying toppled on the floor. "Must be the wind," Jack said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily didn't reply. She couldn't shake the feeling that the door hadn't been forced open. It had been invited. Things escalated quickly after that. By the second week, objects began to disappear. Small things, at first. A set of keys Emily swore she'd left on the kitchen counter. A screwdriver Jack had been using to fix a cabinet hinge. Then, larger things. One morning, Emily woke to find the armchair in the corner of their bedroom missing. She shook Jack awake, her voice high and panicked. "Jack, the chair, where is it?" Jack rubbed his eyes and looked at the empty corner. "Maybe we moved it." "Why would we move it?" They searched the entire house, but the chair was nowhere to be found. That same day, Jack lost his toolbox. "I left it in the dining room," he shouted, frustration coloring his voice as he tore through the downstairs closets. "It was right there on the floor." Emily said nothing. She was beginning to realize that the house wasn't just old and strange. It was hungry. The breaking point came that night. Emily was in the bathroom brushing her teeth when the light bulb above her flickered and went out. She sighed, rinsing her mouth in the dim glow of her phone's flashlight. As she turned to leave, she caught movement in the mirror. She froze. Behind her, in the reflection, the door to the bathroom creaked open. But when she turned, the door was closed. Her breath quickened. She looked back at the mirror. The door was still ajar in the reflection, and behind it, a shadow moved. Emily bolted, slamming the bathroom door behind her as she fled to the bedroom. "Jack," she cried, shaking him awake. "We need to leave." He groaned, sitting up groggily. "What's wrong?" But before she could answer, the door to their bedroom creaked open on its own. The bedroom door swung open slowly, its hinges groaning like a wounded animal. Jack sat up in bed, staring at it with bleary eyes. Emily clutched his arm, her heart pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, rubbing his face. The door stopped moving, left ajar by a few inches. Beyond it, the hallway yawned into darkness, thick and impenetrable. "See?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "This house isn't normal, Jack. Something's wrong." Jack stood, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "It's probably just the wind, Em." She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, a sound broke through the silence, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Jack froze, his head snapping toward the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Emily nodded, her nails digging into the sheets. The whisper grew louder, a low murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Words twisted and tumbled together, unintelligible but undeniably human. Jack hesitated, then grabbed the baseball bat he kept beside the bed. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "No way." Emily slid out of bed, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She flipped on the flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness. "Fine," Jack muttered. "But stay behind me." They crept into the hallway, their footsteps soft against the creaking wood. The whispering stopped as soon as they stepped outside the bedroom, replaced by an oppressive silence. Jack flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. "Damn it. The power's out." Emily shined her flashlight toward the end of the hallway, where the stairs disappeared into the shadowy depths of the first floor. "Do you think someone's in the house?" Jack didn't answer. His grip on the bat tightened as he started down the stairs. Emily followed, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The downstairs felt colder than it should have, the chill biting at their skin. Emily's flashlight beam danced over the living room, the kitchen, the dining room, nothing seemed out of place. But the oppressive sense of being watched was undeniable. "Maybe it was just the house settling," Jack said, though his voice wavered. Emily wanted to believe him. But when they returned to the bedroom, they found the door standing wide open, despite Jack's earlier insistence that he'd shut it before leaving. Over the next few days, the disturbances grew worse. Emily woke one morning to find muddy footprints leading from the front door to the living room. She stared at them, her stomach twisting into knots. "Jack," she called. He stumbled in from the kitchen, his face still groggy from sleep. "What's wrong?" She pointed to the footprints. "Tell me you tracked those in last night." Jack shook his head, his brow furrowing. "I didn't. I haven't been outside since yesterday afternoon." Emily knelt, inspecting the prints. They were long and narrow, but the toes were unnaturally pointed. "These aren't normal," she murmured. Jack crouched beside her, his face pale. Maybe some kind of animal got in. She didn't respond. The prints didn't look like they belonged to any animal she'd ever seen. That night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Jack was sound asleep beside her, his rhythmic breathing a small comfort. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching. Her eyes drifted to the bedroom door. It was closed, just as she'd left it. But then, with excruciating slowness, the handle began to turn. Emily bolted upright, her heart hammering. "Jack," she hissed, shaking his shoulder. He groaned, barely stirring. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. Emily held her breath, straining to see. Was there someone there? For a moment, there was only silence. And then, from the shadows, came a single, deliberate step. "Jack!" Emily screamed, her voice shattering the stillness. Jack shot up, grabbing the baseball bat. "What's going on?" Emily pointed to the door, her hand trembling. "Someone's out there." Jack ran to the doorway, flipping on the flashlight he'd kept on his nightstand. The beam illuminated the empty hallway, revealing nothing but the worn wooden floorboards. "See?" Jack said, his voice tight. "There's no one." A loud crash erupted from downstairs, cutting him off. Emily clung to him, her breathing shallow. "It's the house," she whispered. "It's doing this." Jack didn't reply. He just gripped the bat tighter and led the way down the stairs. The source of the crash was the dining room. The table had been overturned, the chairs scattered across the floor. But what sent a shiver down Emily's spine was the message scrawled on the wall above the fireplace. "Get out." The words were written in a dark, dripping substance. Jack stepped closer, holding the flashlight steady. "Is that paint?" Emily shook her head. She didn't want to say what she was thinking, but the metallic tang in the air confirmed her worst fear. "It's blood," she whispered. Jack turned to her, his face pale. "Okay, this is too much. We're calling the police." But when Jack reached for his phone, he found it wasn't in his pocket. "Damn it," he muttered, running back upstairs. Emily stayed behind, staring at the ominous message. The blood seemed to glisten in the dim light, as if it were fresh. She was about to follow Jack when the whispering returned. It started softly, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then it grew louder, the voices overlapping until they became a chaotic cacophony. Emily clapped her hands over her ears, backing away from the wall. "Jack!" she screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the whispers. The room seemed to close in around her. The walls pulsed, the floor groaned, and the air grew suffocatingly hot. Emily stumbled, her vision blurring. She felt the house watching her, its presence heavy and malevolent. Just as she thought she might collapse, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent. Jack ran back into the room, his face flushed. "Emily, what happened?" "I heard you screaming." She pointed to the wall, but the message was gone. The blood had vanished, leaving the plaster clean and unmarked. "Jack, it was there. I swear." He looked at her, concern etched into his features. You're shaking." She clung to him, her voice trembling. "The house, it's alive, Jack. And it wants us out." Jack wasn't sure what unnerved him more, Emily's trembling insistence that the house was alive or the way the walls seemed to lean inward as she spoke, as if the house itself were listening. "Let's get some air," he said, his voice low and steady, masking the knot tightening in his stomach. "We're both exhausted. This place can feel weird when you're tired." Emily didn't argue. She followed him outside, her hand gripping his arm. The cold night air was a relief, but the house still loomed behind them, casting its shadow across the overgrown yard. They sat on the porch steps, the silence between them heavy. Jack lit a cigarette, a habit he'd sworn he'd quit months ago. Jack, we have to leave, Emily said, breaking the quiet. Jack exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl into the night. And go where? We just sunk everything we have into this place. Sell it. I don't care. I'll live in a shoebox before I spend another night here. Jack frowned, flicking ash onto the gravel. Emily, no one's going to buy it. You've heard the stories. Hell, we only got it because no one else wanted it. If we leave now, we're ruined. Emily opened her mouth to argue, but the distant sound of wood creaking stopped her. They both turned toward the house. Did you hear that? She whispered. Jack nodded, standing slowly. The sound came again, louder this time, a groan that echoed through the night like the deep, resonant breathing of a giant. Stay here, Jack said, his voice tight. He started toward the front door, the cigarette forgotten, still burning between his fingers. Jack, don't. Emily grabbed his arm. But he shook her off gently. It's probably just the wind again. I'll check it out and be right back. He disappeared inside, leaving Emily alone on the porch. She wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes scanning the darkness for any movement. Minutes passed, each one dragging longer than the last. When Jack didn't return, Emily's fear turned to panic. Jack, she called, stepping cautiously to the doorway. No answer. Inside, the air was stifling. Emily's flashlight wavered as she moved through the entryway, her every step echoing in the oppressive silence. Jack, she called again, her voice cracking. A soft thump came from the kitchen. Emily turned, her flashlight illuminating the doorway. Slowly, she crept toward the sound. The kitchen was a mess. Drawers hung open, their contents spilled across the floor. A single chair sat in the middle of the room, its legs bent unnaturally outward as if it had been crushed by an invisible force. Then she saw it, Jack's cigarette, still smoldering on the counter. Jack! Emily's voice broke as she spun around, searching desperately. The door to the basement was ajar. A faint light flickered from below, casting long shadows across the walls. Emily hesitated. She'd never been down to the basement, not since they moved in. Jack had mentioned it was damp and full of junk, promising to clear it out eventually. But now, something was drawing her toward it. The light pulsed softly, like a heartbeat. Against her better judgment, Emily descended the creaking stairs. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with the smell of mildew and earth. Emily's flashlight swept across the space, revealing stacks of forgotten boxes and broken furniture. In the center of the room stood Jack. Jack! Relief flooded her as she hurried toward him. What are you doing down here? But Jack didn't move. His back was to her, his shoulders rigid. Jack! Her voice wavered as she reached out to touch his arm. The second her fingers brushed his sleeve, he turned, too quickly, too smoothly. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. Emily, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Her heart dropped. Something was wrong. This wasn't Jack. Are you okay? She asked, backing away. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted past her, toward the stairs. It's hungry, he whispered. What? Jack's lips twisted into a grotesque smile. The house. It's been waiting for us. For so long. Emily stumbled backward, her flashlight beam trembling. Jack, stop it. You're scaring me. He took a step toward her, his movements jerky and unnatural. We should have listened. It told us to leave. But now it's too late. Jack, please. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment, Emily thought she saw something moving in the shadows. A shape, indistinct but massive, shifting just beyond the edge of her vision. The house groaned, the sound reverberating through the walls. Dust rained from the ceiling as the ground beneath her feet trembled. "Run," Jack said, his voice breaking. His eyes were wide with terror now, his body shaking. "Emily, you have to run." But before she could react, the floor beneath him cracked open. Jack let out a strangled cry as he was pulled downward, his hands clawing at the air. "Jack!" Emily screamed, dropping the flashlight as she lunged toward him. Her fingers grazed his before he disappeared into the darkness. Emily scrambled backward, her heart racing. The hole in the floor was gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken concrete. The only sign of Jack's presence was his flashlight, lying on its side and casting a dim, flickering beam. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, no." The house creaked again, the sound like mocking laughter. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows growing longer and darker. Emily grabbed the flashlight and bolted up the stairs. The door to the basement slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, but she didn't look back. She ran to the front door, yanking at the handle. It didn't budge. "Please," she sobbed, pounding on the door. "Let me out." The house groaned again, its walls pulsing as if alive. Emily turned, pressing her back against the door. And then she saw it. The shadows had gathered in the center of the room, coalescing into a single, writhing mass. It towered over her, its shape shifting constantly, tendrils of darkness reaching toward her like greedy hands. The whispering returned, louder this time, filling her head with words she couldn't understand. Emily screamed, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The shadows surged forward. The shadows surged toward Emily like a tidal wave of darkness, consuming the air itself. She stumbled backward, the flashlight trembling in her grasp. Its feeble beam barely penetrated the writhing black mass. The whispers grew louder, an incomprehensible cacophony that filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts. "Stay back," she screamed, her voice cracking. The house responded with a low groan, the sound reverberating through the walls. The floor beneath her feet shifted, the wooden boards bending and creaking as though alive. Emily turned and bolted for the stairs, her pulse pounding in her ears. The tendrils of darkness followed, slithering along the walls and ceiling, brushing against her heels. The whispers chased her, swelling into a chorus of distorted voices that grew louder with each step. Reaching the second floor, she slammed the bedroom door shut behind her and shoved the dresser in front of it. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely manage the task. She collapsed onto the bed, clutching the flashlight to her chest like a lifeline. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. For a moment, there was silence. Then the whispers returned, softer now, but more insidious. They seemed to seep through the walls, curling around her like invisible fingers. The house was alive. And it was starving. Emily sat frozen on the bed, her mind racing. Jack's voice echoed in her memory, "It's hungry. The house. It's been waiting for us." "Jack," she whispered, her throat tight. She couldn't leave him. She wouldn't. But she couldn't deny the truth. The house wanted her too. A sudden knock at the bedroom door made her jump. It was slow and deliberate, each knock reverberating like a heartbeat. "Emily," a voice called softly. She froze. "Emily, it's me." Her heart leapt at the sound of Jack's voice. She scrambled to her feet, her hand hovering over the dresser she'd wedged against the door. "Jack," she called, her voice trembling. "It's okay," he said. "I'm here. Open the door." But something about his tone was off. It lacked the warmth she knew so well. "Where did you go?" she asked, her hand still on the dresser. "What happened to you in the basement?" There was a pause. Then, "It doesn't matter. Just open the door." Emily's grip tightened on the flashlight. "No. Not until you tell me what's going on." The voice on the other side of the door changed, its softness replaced by something sharper, colder. "Emily, don't make this harder than it has to be. Open the door." She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. "You're not Jack," she whispered. The thing on the other side laughed, low and guttural. "You're right," it said. "But he's still here, somewhere. Would you like to see him?" Emily's stomach twisted. The knocking started again, faster this time, more insistent. The door rattled in its frame, and the dresser began to slide forward as if pushed by an unseen force. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. Gripping the flashlight, she turned and ran to the window. The night outside was pitch black, the hill shrouded in mist. Emily fumbled with the lock, throwing the window open. The cold air bit at her skin as she climbed onto the ledge, her legs trembling. Below, the ground seemed impossibly far away. "Emily," the voice roared, its anger shaking the walls. The bedroom door burst open, the dresser toppling over with a deafening crash. Emily didn't look back. She closed her eyes and leapt. The fall was shorter than she expected, the overgrown grass cushioning her landing. She rolled onto her side, gasping for air. Above her, the window slammed shut, the house groaning in protest. Emily scrambled to her feet and ran, her bare feet tearing through the weeds. She didn't stop until she reached the base of the hill, the house now a distant shadow against the horizon. She collapsed onto the pavement of the empty road, her chest heaving. Her body ached, and her mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. What was she supposed to do now? Jack was gone. The house wouldn't let him go, not without a fight. But as much as she wanted to flee, to leave the cursed place behind forever, she couldn't shake the image of Jack's face in the basement, his desperate plea, "Run." She couldn't abandon him. Taking a deep breath, she pulled herself to her feet. She would go to the police, to anyone who would listen. She would bring help. Emily stumbled toward the faint glow of the town in the distance. The diner was quiet when Emily burst in, her disheveled appearance drawing the attention of the few late-night patrons. "Help," she gasped, clutching the counter for support. "Please. My husband is trapped." "The house." The waitress behind the counter frowned, her eyes narrowing. "Are you talking about the Whitaker place?" Emily nodded frantically. "Yes. Please, you have to call someone." "No one's going up there," the waitress said firmly, cutting her off. "What? Why?" "Because that house doesn't let people go," an older man at the counter said, his voice grim. "Never has. You're lucky you made it out alive." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "But my husband, Jack, is still in there. We can't just leave him." The waitress exchanged a look with the older man, then leaned closer. "Listen to me, honey. That house, it's not just haunted. It's cursed. It takes people. Families, couples, doesn't matter. They go in, and they don't come out. Not all of them, anyway. I don't care about curses." Emily snapped, her desperation mounting. "We have to do something." The older man sighed, shaking his head. "You won't find anyone here willing to go near that place. My advice? Get as far away as you can. Forget him." Emily stared at them, her blood running cold. "I can't forget him," she said. "I won't." She turned and ran out of the diner, their warnings echoing in her ears. Standing at the base of the hill once more, Emily looked up at the house. Its silhouette loomed against the moonless sky, its windows glowing faintly like malevolent eyes. "I'm coming back for you, Jack," she whispered. Clutching her flashlight tightly, she began the long climb back up the hill. The wind clawed at Emily's face as she trudged up the hill, her flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of dread pressing down on her. The Whitaker house loomed larger with every moment, its windows flickering faintly, like the unblinking eyes of a predator watching its prey return. You don't have to do this. The thought flickered in her mind, but she shoved it aside. Jack was in there, alive or not, she didn't know. But she couldn't leave him to that thing. The front door creaked open as she approached, an invitation she didn't want but couldn't refuse. Inside, the air was thick and damp, the metallic scent stronger than ever. Emily's flashlight flickered as she stepped over the threshold, her heart racing. "Jack," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The house answered with a low groan, the walls seeming to shudder in response. The whispers returned, threading through the silence like a song played in reverse. Emily pressed on, gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles ached. The living room was just as she'd left it, the overturned furniture scattered like the aftermath of a storm. But now, the shadows were deeper, darker, as though they had been waiting for her. She moved toward the staircase, the wooden steps creaking beneath her weight. Every sound seemed amplified, her breaths loud and ragged in the suffocating silence. "Jack," she called again, louder this time. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the house was eerily still. Then, from above her, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Emily froze, her flashlight aimed at the top of the stairs. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, descending slowly but steadily. "Jack," she tried again, her voice trembling. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette. Heart soared with hope. "Jack! Oh my God, is that you?" But as the figure stepped into the light, her relief turned to horror. It was Jack, but not as she remembered him. His skin was pale and mottled, his eyes sunken and lifeless. His movements were stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being dragged by invisible strings. "Emily," he said, his voice a hollow echo. She stumbled back, tears blurring her vision. "Jack, what's happened to you?" "It's not me," he whispered, his lips barely moving. "Run." Before she could respond, the floor beneath her buckled, and she fell backward, landing hard on the ground floor. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she scrambled to her feet, the flashlight rolling away. "Emily!" Jack's voice screamed from above, but it was no longer his. It was guttural, inhuman. She grabbed the flashlight and ran, her instincts screaming at her to get out. But the front door slammed shut before she reached it, the heavy sound reverberating through the house. "Let me out," she shouted, pounding on the door. The house groaned in reply, warping as if they were alive. Emily turned, pressing her back against the door. The living room was gone, replaced by a long, dark corridor that stretched impossibly far. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder and more menacing. Her legs felt like lead as she moved down the hallway, the flashlight flickering weakly. The walls pulsed with a sickening rhythm, like a heartbeat, and the floor beneath her seemed to ripple with each step. At the end of the corridor, a door appeared, a massive, ornate thing carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. Emily hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But something, some pull she couldn't explain, urged her forward. She pushed the door open, and the temperature dropped sharply, her breath visible in the icy air. The room was vast, far larger than it should have been, given the size of the house. The walls were covered in what looked like veins, dark and throbbing, pumping a viscous black liquid. In the center of the room was a pit, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. And beside the pit stood Jack. "Emily," he said, his voice weak and broken. She ran to him, tears streaming down her face. "Jack! Thank God! I thought I lost you." He shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You shouldn't have come back." Before she could respond, the pit began to pulse, the light growing brighter. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the room, and the air vibrated with an unbearable intensity. "Emily, listen to me," Jack said, gripping her shoulders. The house, it's alive. It's a predator. It lures people here, feeds on them, and traps their souls. You have to go before it takes you too. I'm not leaving without you, she said, her voice firm despite the terror clawing at her. Jack smiled sadly. I'm already gone. The Jack you knew died the moment I fell into that pit. No, she said, shaking her head. There has to be a way. The ground trembled, and the pit erupted with light. A massive, shadowy form began to rise from its depths, tendrils of darkness slithering toward them. Run! Jack shouted, pushing her away. Jack, she screamed, reaching for him. But the tendrils wrapped around him, dragging him toward the pit. Emily, go, he cried, his voice breaking. Don't let it take you too. Tears streaming down her face, Emily turned and ran. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pulsating violently as the whispers turned to screams. The house fought her every step of the way. The floor shifted beneath her, the walls pressed inward, and the air grew so heavy she could barely breathe. But she kept running, her flashlight flickering wildly. Finally, she reached the front door. She grabbed the handle and yanked with all her strength. It didn't budge. The whispers turned to laughter, low and mocking. The house had no intention of letting her leave. No, she growled, her fear giving way to anger. You're not keeping me here. She swung the flashlight against the door, shattering the glass pane. Cold night air rushed in, and Emily reached through the jagged opening to unlock the door from the outside. The moment the lock clicked, the house let out a deafening roar, the walls shaking violently. Emily threw the door open and ran into the night, the laughter of the house echoing in her ears. At the bottom of the hill, she collapsed onto the pavement, her body trembling. She looked back at the house, its windows glowing faintly like eyes watching her retreat. Jack was gone. The house had won. But she was free. Or so she thought. Emily sat at the base of the hill, staring at the house. The glow in its windows pulsed faintly, as though the house were alive and breathing. Every instinct screamed at her to keep running, to put as much distance between herself and that cursed place as possible. But she couldn't move. Her heart ached, torn between grief and guilt. Jack was gone, swallowed by the darkness of that house, and she had been powerless to stop it. The thought gnawed at her, clawing its way deeper with every second. The wind carried the faintest whisper to her ears. Emily. She froze. The voice was unmistakable. Jack. Her head snapped toward the house. The whispers returned, threading through the night air like a siren song. Emily, come back. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't possible. Jack had begged her to leave. He'd told her he was already gone. And yet. The voice was so real, so familiar. Jack, she whispered, taking an unsteady step forward. The glow in the windows brightened, the faint outline of a figure appearing in the topmost one. It was him. Emily, please, the voice called again, softer this time. She took another step, then another. Her pulse raced as she climbed the hill, her mind clouded with a desperate hope. If there was even the slightest chance that Jack was still alive, she couldn't leave him behind. By the time she reached the front door, her hands were trembling. The door swung open on its own, the shadows within beckoning her. Jack, she said, stepping inside. I'm here. Where are you? The door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into darkness. The house was different now. The walls were no longer solid but seemed to ripple like liquid, the air thick and oppressive. Emily's flashlight sputtered, its beam cutting feebly through the suffocating blackness. Jack, she called, her voice echoing unnaturally. Emily, his voice replied, distant but unmistakable. She followed the sound, her footsteps faltering as the floor shifted beneath her. The house groaned, the walls pulsating as though alive. The voice led her to the staircase, now warped and uneven. She hesitated, but the pull was irresistible. "Jack, I'm coming." She climbed the stairs, the whispers growing louder with every step. At the top, the hallway stretched impossibly long, the air growing colder and heavier. "Emily," Jack's voice called again, closer now. She ran toward the sound, her desperation overpowering her fear. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar, light spilling out in a faint, flickering glow. Emily pushed it open, her breath hitching at what she saw. The room was the basement. Or at least, it looked like the basement. The same throbbing walls, the same glowing pit in the center. But now, the pit was larger, its light brighter, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. And there, standing beside it, was Jack. "Emily," he said, his voice soft. Tears filled her eyes as she ran to him. "Jack. Oh, thank God. I thought I lost you." He caught her in his arms, holding her tightly. For a moment, the world seemed to still. But something wasn't right. His body was cold, his arms stiff. When she pulled back to look at him, his face was pale, his eyes hollow. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice breaking. Her stomach twisted. "Jack, what's happening? What's wrong?" Before he could answer, the pit erupted with light, and a deep, guttural roar filled the room. Emily turned to see the shadowy mass rising from its depths once more, its tendrils reaching toward them. "Emily, go!" Jack shouted, pushing her away. "Get out while you can." "No," she cried, grabbing his arm. "I'm not leaving you." The tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Jack's legs. He screamed, his face contorted with pain. "Emily, you have to go." She grabbed his hands, pulling with all her strength. "I'm not letting you go again." The house roared, the walls shaking violently. The tendrils tightened their grip, dragging Jack closer to the pit. "Emily," he cried, his voice filled with despair. "It's too late for me. Save yourself." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't." The tendrils whipped toward her, but she didn't let go. With a final, desperate pull, she yanked Jack free from their grasp. They both fell backward, landing hard on the floor. For a moment, there was silence. Then the pit began to collapse in on itself, the light fading as the shadowy mass let out a deafening screech. The house trembled, the walls cracking and splintering as the very foundation seemed to give way. Emily helped Jack to his feet, her heart racing. "Come on," she shouted, pulling him toward the door. They stumbled down the hallway, the house groaning and roaring around them. The stairs buckled beneath their feet, but they managed to reach the ground floor. The front door stood wide open, the night air beckoning them. They ran through it just as the house let out one final, deafening roar. Behind them, the walls collapsed inward, the entire structure folding into itself as though devoured by an invisible force. They didn't stop running until they reached the base of the hill. Turning back, they watched as the house disappeared completely, leaving only an empty patch of land where it had stood. For a long time, they sat in silence, clutching each other tightly. "Jack," Emily finally said, her voice trembling. "What was that? What is this place?" He shook his head, his eyes distant. "I don't know. But it's gone now." She looked at him, her heart aching with both relief and lingering fear. "It's really gone." Jack nodded, but his expression was grim. "For now." As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Emily and Jack rose, leaning on each other as they walked toward the distant town. But as they left the hill behind, neither of them noticed the faint whisper that lingered in the air. "Hungry."